Have you ever caught yourself scrolling through your phone knowing full well there's something important you should be doing? Well, obviously, and if you said no, you're lying, and the correct answer is yes, all the bloody time, and it makes me feel like So procrastination is a term that's been thrown around for many years now, and I think most of us are quite familiar with it. But it wasn't until I actually studied the science behind procrastination that I actually began to understand it. And here's the thing, procrastination is not about laziness like most of us think. It's actually a battle between your brain and your goals. And today we're diving into the ugly science behind why we put things off and how to finally break free from a lot of it. So for me, understanding the science behind procrastination is the first step in actually trying to overcome it. And one of the main things that stood out to me when I was doing my research was that procrastination is not about laziness. It's actually about emotional mismanagement. And there's some really interesting studies by Fuchsia Sira and Timothy Peichel that actually prove this. They posit that procrastination is about short-term mood relief as opposed to long-term goals. And obviously this doesn't sound like an ideal strategy to forego the long-term in favor of feeling better in the short-term. But I think most of us can relate to this, especially if you go back to the days when you were studying either high school or college and think about when you had a big project coming up and you decided to not do it in that moment and to just postpone it. And when you make that decision to postpone it and maybe go to a party or see some friends, you feel an initial sense of satisfaction and comfort. But that is only very short-lived, and the long-term repercussions actually generate more stress than having done the work in the first place. A 1997 study by Thies and Baumeister showed that student procrastinators, while initially feeling less stress, actually end up with worse grades, higher stress levels, and even health problems at the end of the semester. And all of these impulses to procrastinate go back to our caveman brains. Concepts like present bias and temporal discounting are so hardwired into our brain, and this leads to something called the intention-action gap. The gap between what you intend to do and what you actually end up doing. Our brains are essentially hardwired to prioritize immediate reward as opposed to future benefits. And this is obviously magnified today because we have so many options in front of us, whether it be activities for work or leisure, that our brain simply cannot decide. It enters into a mode of decision paralysis. And the easiest way to deal with that anxiety is simply to procrastinate. Peichel's studies actually show that procrastination is not about avoiding work, it's about avoiding the negative feelings associated with that work. And I think that's such an important thing to understand because procrastination is a term that gets thrown around so constantly and so ruthlessly today, and we use it on ourselves, even sometimes to describe ourselves in a completely wrong way, because procrastination, again, is not about being lazy or about not being able to handle your goals or handle responsibilities. It's more about not having enough strategies to deal with the negative emotions associated with a lot of the work that you are doing. And here's where the blast mnemonic comes into play. Whenever you're either bored, lonely, angry, sad, or tired, a red flag should immediately go up in your mind for you to step back, take a moment, take a deep breath and say, okay, I'm probably going to react to this emotional state. And right now I'm in a vulnerable emotion position and I'm probably going to procrastinate on something important. So write blast in a post-it note, and whenever you're feeling one of those 5 emotional states, just take a breather and make sure you understand how that can lead to procrastination. And to wrap up all of this scientific mumbo jumbo with a bow, I thought it'd be helpful to take a broader look of what's actually happening inside your brain. So procrastination is essentially a medieval battle between your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, decision-making, and the limbic system is that reward center. That area of your brain that receives immediate gratification whenever you see a cat playing a piano on TikTok. And so procrastination is a lot more than a psychological phenomenon. It goes deeper into the neuropsychological. So much so that chronic procrastinators have been shown to struggle with executive functions, task initiation, and even emotional control. Because whenever you procrastinate, you're essentially pushing that responsibility to your future self. Because you think your future self will be either more capable or more motivated to complete the task at hand. But by doing that, and the more you procrastinate, the more it is a future burden for your future self, which if you couldn't deal with now, how on earth are you going to expect your future self to be dealing with all of that stress, all of that anxiety, all of that workload? Obviously it's impossible, but I think the really important thing here is to understand it actually has to do with the way our brains are wired, understanding that, but it's not enough to understand how brains work on average. I think to be truly effective against procrastination, you have to understand how your brain works individually. So procrastination obviously is not a one-size-fits-all issue. It's tied to your personality, to your emotional tendencies, and different psychological profiles require different solutions. So I'm going to leave a few options below for something called the Big 5 personality test, a psychological quiz that tests for the 5 main personality traits and where you are on the spectrum. So it tests for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Understanding a complete picture of your psychology is one of the first steps in truly being able to deal with procrastination. Because if you're very high in openness, you're a bit of a thrill seeker, you're going to be more vulnerable to procrastination whenever you're more anxious or a little more emotionally vulnerable. And if you're very high in conscientiousness, for example, you're going to fall victim to perfectionism, and that perfectionism is not going to allow you to complete work and is going to force you sometimes to procrastinate on certain things because you make a bigger deal out of it than it actually is. So I'm going to leave a few options for the Big 5 personality test down below. There's some free ones, there's some paid ones. Obviously the paid ones are going to be better, are going to be a little more in depth, are going to give you a more complete view of what is going on inside your brain. The one I've done myself is called Understand Myself. I did it a few years ago and it's paid, but you can usually find some discount codes online. So if I find anything, I'm definitely gonna leave it linked down below as well. And it's a super complete test because it gives you a really in-depth view of your mind, but it also allows you to compare your personality tendencies to someone else's. So if you have a significant other, you can do that comparison, and it's something that's really cool, really interesting. So definitely worth the little investment. So let's talk about some micro and macro strategies that can help us deal with procrastination depending on which psychological tendencies we have. So there's a few strategies that are going to help everybody. So micro goal setting is essentially breaking down a large task into bite-sized chunks, and this reduces the feeling of being overwhelmed by a very large task. Another thing you can do is to have an implementation intention, and the template goes like this. If X happens, then I will do Y. So if it's 8 a.m., I will start writing for 10 minutes. When I get home, I will work on my side hustle for 15 minutes. These little implementation intentions allow you to get rid of decision fatigue. And finally, dopamine-friendly tactics like gamifying certain tasks, gamifying certain work responsibilities. I'm gonna leave a wonderful gamification book down below. Read it. It has a ton of applicable and practical things that you can apply to your daily life to make work and life in general a little more exciting, a little more spicy. But now is when your psychological tendencies and knowing them can actually help you a lot. I'm going to inelegantly divide into two main groups, perfectionists and thrill seekers. So you might be in both, there's certainly some overlap, but the strategies are going to be slightly different for each group. Perfectionists, for example, struggle to begin certain tasks because they fear they will not be able to maintain a high standard of quality. And this leads them to procrastinate throughout the entire process of work. So if you're a perfectionist, you need to learn to start messy. And there's three main things that I would recommend. The 2-minute rule, setting a timer for working only 2 minutes and starting as messy as you can, as fast as you can. Setting strict quality limits to your tasks so you know when you actually finished. And finally, having a clear scope of work, knowing how you need to do things, when you need to do things, and by when you need to do things. Have all of that systematized and it should help you immensely. Now for thrill seekers, it's a completely different thing. Thrill seekers depend on dopamine and on the excitement and motivation to complete a task to actually even get started. So for thrill seekers, maintaining motivation and growing motivation is very important. So setting artificial deadlines, making intermediate tasks exciting and rewarding yourself along the way are crucial. Gamifying the entire experience if you're a thrill seeker is what's going to help you the most. And now moving on to the more macro ways in which you can tackle procrastination. Having a negative self-image is definitely something that is going to make things even worse. So for example, if you say that you're a procrastinator and that's something you constantly repeat to yourself and you tell other people, this is only going to reinforce that fact and is going to make getting rid of procrastination much harder. So instead of constantly reinforcing that identity of procrastinator and that self-perception, stop talking about it. Stop mentioning the word. Just try and focus on the day-to-day and on small incremental improvements. And being able to find meaning in your tasks is another great way to beat procrastination, because if you're more emotionally invested in whatever work you're doing, it's going to be easier to feel motivation. It's going to be easier to complete the work. It's going to be easier to stay longer hours and work more time. There's actually an emotional stake. There's a psychological stake in the work you are doing. Because even if you think your work is not particularly inspiring or fulfilling, there's always something we can do to try and be more connected emotionally, psychologically to our work. And I think it just takes a little bit of time to dig a little deeper, ask more questions, understand what impact this is having on what groups of people, and that can usually help us to feel more connected and thus avoid procrastination. And obviously knowing all of these things, all of this science, all of these tools, understanding your mind a little better is gonna be incredibly helpful. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that reconfiguring that relationship we have with procrastination is not gonna happen overnight. This is a journey that is going to take daily effort. But that's the thing to keep in mind, that the important thing is progress, not perfection. And the more we keep pushing and improving and getting better and understanding how to regulate ourselves emotionally and when we are more vulnerable to procrastination is the best we can hope for. Procrastination probably is never going to be eliminated 100%, especially if you have a psychological tendency towards it, but you can definitely know know when you are more vulnerable to it and how to deal with it most effectively. So definitely check the resources down below, the books that I linked, but especially the Big 5 personality test. Make sure you do that, understand what the hell is going on up there, and keep kicking ass. If you found this useful and are looking for more specific methods to beat procrastination, some weird methods that you probably haven't tried, definitely check this video. Thanks for watching, much love from me, muchachos, and see you in the next one.